I want to start off just for the newcomers here. I'm James Dedarian, I'm the director of the Center for International Security Studies. I want to also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to all elders past, present, emerging. So welcome, everybody. This is our third now global forum in this room. This is the sixth global forum, and the idea of these are to address pressing global issues in a timely and critical manner, something somewhere between the sort of noise you get in the everyday, blitz of the media and the long, peals of thunder that follow in the academic journals. This is our attempt to make an intervention. That's why it's being filmed. We're going to put this up after a light edit and get it out to our fellow scholars and hopefully to the public. Now, this is the third global forum held in this room. You probably see in the back here a lot of dead white men. These are philosophers, and that's why it's called the Philosopher's Room. And a very famous philosopher taught in this room, John Anderson. It holds a special significance for us because as the Chalice Chair of Philosophy from 1927 to 1958, he set a standard. And it's something that we hope to emulate in these global forums. He was a contrarian. He was twice censored by the Senate. He attracted a lot of hostile press. He went from the left to the right, and he made enemies, it seemed, irregardless of where your position was on the political spectrum, because he really believed the role of an educator was to be critical. That he has a quote, and I'm going to put that quote up because this is from John Anderson. The work of the academic is criticism, but it's also the awakening of the mind to the need for criticism, to the uncertainty of the principles by which it supposed itself to be guided. Now, this has a personal connection for me because one of the people who sat in these seats was Hedley Bull, a pretty famous Australian scholar, went and became the Montague Burton Chair of International Relations. And he said something similar in the preface to his amazing, remarkable book, The Making of the World Order. It was called Anarchical Society. And what Hedley Bull said, first he acknowledged in the preface, my intellectual debt is to John Anderson, a greater man than many who are more famous. But he went on to say that inquiry has its own morality and is necessarily subversive of political institutions and movements of all kinds, good as well as bad. Now, here in the Global Forum, we seek to capture that spirit. It's something that I think is the role of educators to follow these two great Australian scholars, to engage in critical inquiry, to question first principles, and subvert, when necessary, accepted wisdom. So to bring some incisive thinking to the global implications of US presidential elections, or the US elections in general, we've brought four prominent members of the center. And I'm delighted to say, Laura Shepard couldn't join us. I'm not delighted about that. It's unfortunate. But I'm delighted to say that we've had, stepping in, is someone who's just become a doctor. And we're very glad that Sean and Terry could join us. Also by coincidence, it just so happens that her honors thesis at Sydney was on gender and race on the presidential election. So that's really timely way to celebrate her, both the doctor, but also her getting honors here at the university. So I'm going to very quickly introduce people. Brendan O'Connor down at the end is the professor of government of international relations. He has written books on American exceptionalism. He is an expert on foreign policy and elections. And I'm sure he'll be willing to say something about the Indo-Pacific region that is now so fraught with what the outcome of this election might lie with Taiwan, China, and elsewhere. We're going down the line. Also, Sean Perry, who's as I just mentioned, she's a lecturer in gender and global governance. Her work intersects gender as well as the areas of climate change and US politics. And David, you might know, because he seems like he's on every newscast every day. He's also associate professor here and a member of CISS, and he really looks at the role of minorities, but a particular focus on the impact and the role of religion in the US. So that, I'm sure, will come up. And Sarah Phillips is a professor of global conflict and development, and her research interests are in international intervention. She has a particular geographic focus on the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa, but might be enticed to talk a little bit about the Middle East as well, I hope. Unavoidable. And David Schlossberg is the director of the Sydney Environment Institute, and he's a professor of environmental politics. He has been doing some really innovative work on justice, environmental justice, ecological democracy, and climate adaptation. Now, we're very fortunate today to have Stan Grant, who's you probably know from his television career, but before that was an international journalist, an award-winning journalist. He's a filmmaker, the author of best-selling books on world affairs, philosophy, theology, political science, and also indigenous history. I also recently discovered that he's incredibly well-versed in quantum theory. Maybe he'll even say something about that, and he has a new book out, next book after this next one, coming out perhaps about that. He's also a fan of Oasis, as we learned at lunch, but we're probably going to let that one slide. We're also hoping that this will be part of a longer relationships with CISS. He's been doing a lot of work at the nexus of the incredible affinities between indigenous cosmologies and quantum theory. So we're really grateful that he was able to make it for this. So that's by way of an introduction. We're not here for political grandstanding or any national cheerleading. Our intent is to keep this dialogical. We're trying to depolarize a pretty polarized situation. And so we're going to try to keep this non-polemical. Stan's going to leave a lot of time for questions, critical questions you might hope to raise with us. So it's my honor, my privilege, and genuine delight to now turn the proceedings over to Stan, who will kick off the conversation with some of his own opening remarks about the situation we're in today.
Thank you, James, and thank you for making me sound more impressive than I am. So that's always good. Thank you for coming along. I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people as well, and from my people, the Wiradjuri, Kamilaroi and Dharawal, to acknowledge my ancestors, any First Nations people in the room, to yours as well, and to all of you from where you have come to be part of this conversation. In a place where my people have had these conversations for many thousands of years. I wanted to start, before we come, you don't want to hear too much from me, but I wanted to start before we sort of frame this conversation. And once again, as James said, it's here for you, so we'll come to you for your questions. We really want to hear from you. But when I think about the American election, it puts me in mind of a joke that the novelist David Foster Wallace told at a commencement lecture. And he spoke about fish. And there were two young fish swimming in the water. An older fish swam by. The older fish said, "How are you doing? How's the water today?" The two younger fish swam on a bit further and turned to each other and said, "What's water?" I look at that and I hear that joke and I think about the American election. Because we're reporting on something, we're commenting on something, people are voting into something, they're swimming in water, and I wonder if they even know that they're drowning. I wonder if they even know that they are surrounded by water. I wrote an essay for the monthly magazine, bringing my own insights, my own thoughts about the American election. And I saw this as a nadir of the American project. That the American project, which of its essence was about the creation of a new human being. That this is an Enlightenment nation. This is a break from tradition. This is the first of the modern nations. Not a nation of blood and soil, not a nation of kin and culture and faith, but a nation of an idea. And an Enlightenment idea of rationality that in Kantian terms could possibly create a perpetual peace out of a cosmopolitanism. But at the heart of that idea was a reality of genocide of First Nations people, a reality of slavery, a reality of gangsterism where the strong have prevailed in America over the meek. And something I'll come to Brendan a little bit later about. A myth of exceptionalism that derives from a brute force that may have altruism as part of its offering, but also contend or lend towards a totalitarianism. And if we look at America today, we look at a country that in so many ways appears exhausted, a country that we know appears almost ungovernable, a country that for all of its massive military might is unable to win a war and unable to bring peace to warring states of the world that America is deeply engaged in. An America that, after 20 years, abandons Afghanistan to the Taliban, who just the other day have decided that women cannot hear each other's voices. And in America, where the top 1% of the country holds wealth 13 times greater than the bottom 50% combined. There was one statistic I read recently that if you are living on the minimum wage in America, if you are working, there is not a single county in the United States where you can rent a 2-bedroom apartment. And I look at Kamala Harris and Donald Trump and I ask, are these two capable of providing the answers to what in so many ways is such a broken project? These are the sort of things I want to discuss with our panel today. The quality or otherwise of the candidates. What creates the modern America? What does it mean for us? And in many ways, in the world today, we are all Americans. What happens in America undoubtedly affects us all. So I wanted to start first of all with a question, a general question to the panel. I'll start on the end with you, Brendan, because you have written about this idea of American exceptionalism. What does that look like when we take a snapshot of America today and wonder what the founding fathers would make of their creation?
Well, in many ways, that's a project that Donald Trump puts a sort of stop to. I mean, Trump isn't someone who believes in a traditional notion of American exceptionalism. He's in some ways seen that as part of the kind of nonsense rhetoric of previous presidents promoting America as in some ways a kind of national self-help project. The sense of Obama exhausts, maybe, and George W. Bush exhausts this idea of American exceptionalism. Marco Rubio has tried to beat the drum for it, but not, got much progress. Trump comes along and says, we're brutal, we like other people, we occasionally kill people, we're not any different, but we're going to be great again. And that's something I think quite different.
What does he mean by that? Beyond just the MAGA hat, is there some lot that clearly has appeal? 75 million people next week are going to vote for Donald Trump. He got more votes at the last election than any sitting president in American history, even though he lost. So what is the appeal to the counter to exceptionalism and the idea of greatness again?
It's positioning. I mean, most of Trump's sort of commentary isn't about truth claims. I mean, the media gets caught up on this, he can't be saying this is a lie, that's a lie. It's positioning. I'm better than you. I'm a winner, you're a loser. We're going to be great, these other nations are not going to be so great. Now, that's a very simplistic kind of marketing kind of approach to politics. Make America Great Again was, this sloganized politics, but there has been obviously some cut through with that.
A lot of cut through.
A lot of cut through, the bad manners, even the Madison Square Garden kind of, for many, seems a kind of a debacle or kind of has echoes of all of the kind of worst moments of the 20th century. But for many sort of Trump loyalists and many people who are disillusioned with politics, this bad manners, the sense of America is going to, in some ways, give the middle finger to a lot of elites, to a lot of kind of niceties. This has been a pretty successful formula. And we're looking at a candidate who really breaks a kind of huge trend in American politics that goes back a long way, that the person with the most money of the two candidates tends to win. I mean, Obama had a lot more money than his opponents. Bush had a bit more money than Gore. Clinton was very well financed. Reagan. Trump had significantly less money than Hillary Clinton, a half. He'll have who have a lot less money than Harris, but a candidate with this kind of brutal message, this message that doesn't sort of speak to people's best hopes and dreams and angels. That message has got a 50-50% chance of being the message of the next president.
Xian, if Americans are all swimming in the same water, is it not just a pox on both houses?
Well, obviously my kind of specific interests are in the role that gender and masculinity have, one, always played in US presidential elections, but particularly in this election. I think it's not just about the two candidates that are going against each other, but it's about the voting base at large as well. It's about how certain parts of the population feel particularly disenfranchised with the system, how that's related to class, to indeed religious identity as well, and this particular kind of yearn for an old school masculinity, which Trump, I think, is so effective at performing to the people that wish to follow him. Seeing how close the fact that we can't currently kind of call the election, I think demonstrates to us that so many people are currently feeling disenfranchised, whether it's to do with their kind of pessimism about the US economic situation at the moment, or regarding international relations as well, and where the United States sits within the world. That message of, I'm going to take us out of the world and I'm going to focus on you, is really cutting across to a lot of middle America.
Is that because, Xian, I mean, two things you said there was a feeling and also a perception, but aren't they real? If 1% of the population that both candidates and all of the American establishment belong to hold 13 times the wealth of the bottom 50%. If during the Obama years, deaths of despair, that is people who are killing themselves, opioid addiction, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, gun violence, amongst whites, it had sadly always been happening amongst the brown and the black and the marginalised, but amongst whites, from 40 to 55 tripled. Your postcode is your life expectancy. Life expectancy in America is going down. There are people who no longer even look for a job or imagine owning a home. That's a reality, isn't it? So why is Trump, and if we just take the fact that Trump's been in power, he's been out of power, he's back again, the polls are at least neck and neck, and Kamala Harris has not been able to make a significant dent in this. Beyond the grotesque parody that we see, what are people telling us who are living the reality of the American grind, not the American dream?
I completely agree with your assessment that it is the reality, right? What I would say to that is that Trump has always been a hypocrite, and of course we point out hypocrisy in conservative movements a lot. Trump is very good, and was very good in the 2016 election, at painting Hillary Clinton as part of the elite establishment, right? And positioning himself as the anti-establishment candidate. However, we know that Donald Trump is not for the everyday person. He never has been. So, recognizing institutional failure in America, recognizing all of those issues which you pointed out, the issues with a lack of proper healthcare system, the issues with lack of access to education, it's pointing out, we're in this room, college debts. These are real tangible issues. Communities in the States are telling us, right, that they are struggling and they're failing. I think Trump has cut through effectively, despite his hypocrisy, to these communities. And it's about, I think the real challenge is, if people have an issue with the existing system because they feel that it's not serving them, then how do candidates, especially with Trump's kind of populism, respond and effectively in the future take us back away from that populist rhetoric? Yes.
Is there a path back from that, David? Did Obama, if we look at who begets whom, Obama begets Trump. If we talk about hypocrisy, is there anything more hypocritical than a president who says, yes, we can, and believe in hope, and the first thing he does is bail out the corrupt bankers while people lose their homes? A president who wins a Nobel Prize for peace and carries out more drone attacks on civilians than any other president. I walked through a village on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan and saw the ground littered with bodies just from one of those drone attacks. Children, women, civilians. If people are factoring in the proto-fascism, the grotesque behaviour of Donald Trump, and are prepared to look beyond that, and the hypocrisy, what does that say about what the others who have been in power, the Democrats, for 16 of the past 20 years have delivered?
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about Obama begetting Trump. Trump won a lot of the counties in the upper Midwest that Obama won twice. Like Trump, Obama visited those counties, held very boisterous rallies there. And like Trump, he was promising that the government could do something for people. Yes, we can and make America great again. Rhetorically, there's not much difference between those two statements. I cannot see any president in the near future failing to disappoint everybody. And one of the reasons for this is there's this pathological disconnection that just seems to grow bigger every election between the cult of the presidency and what people expect from the presidency and what presidents promise
And can do.
and what they can actually do. And the big factor in all of this is that it is almost impossible to get any major legislation through Congress. There has to be a severe tear in the fabric of reality.
Can I just stop you there, because that's
Yes.
really interesting.
Yeah.
Clinton did. When he lost Congress, he was a better president.
Yes, yeah.
LBJ did. What has happened in America that we have, and that's reflected a little bit in Australia as well, with the politics of no, the combativeness, the lack of a shared project. What has happened in America to go from a capacity to reach across the aisle, and Obama essentially just gave up on the project, to now when we can't do it?
Yeah, well, this is to add another layer of pathology to this, I would locate the breakdown of bipartisan possibilities in Congress to the decline of the Southern Democratic Bloc. Now, the problem with blaming it on the decline of the Southern Democratic Bloc is there's a lot of things about the Southern Democratic Bloc that should not be missed in any way. This was the bloc that prevented civil rights legislation, prevented even anti-lynching legislation happening for 100 years. While that bloc existed, though, it meant that there were all kinds of social identities that cut across party lines. If you were conservative, you weren't necessarily a Republican. If you were an evangelical Christian, you weren't necessarily a Republican. If you were gay, you were not necessarily a Democrat. There were a lot of different overlapping social identities, which meant that party identity, both inside and outside Congress, did not matter so much. Now what you have is such a high correlation between party identity and race, religiosity, region, increasingly gender.
Culture war.
Yeah, it means party identity has become this banner under which all other identities march. And that is a very dangerous situation because there are taboos against hating people for their race or their religion or their gender or their sexuality or where they live. There are no taboos on hating people because of their party identity. That is a licensed form of hate in the United States. But when you consider how highly correlated all these other social identities actually are with party identity, what you can see is the old wars being fought under new banners. But in this kind of particularly self-righteous way. And so, I mean, there are still people in Congress who try for bipartisan cooperation. But when we see majorities that are so narrow, there's very little hope of cooperation. There's a lot of possibility of parties tearing themselves apart, as the Republicans have done. But yeah, getting major legislation through Congress, the only time it's really happened in the last 10 years was with the pandemic. All of a sudden, the pandemic did create this new reality for a few months where, because survival was the issue, because everybody realised people are going to starve, people are going to fall so far through the net that there'll be no hope of recovering them. There was this remarkable series of pieces of legislation passed on a very bipartisan basis, first while Trump was president, then while Biden was president, which kept Americans alive during the pandemic. The problem was, as soon as the pandemic was over, it's like people forget those possibilities of collective action. Forget the idea that the government might have a responsibility to the people.
Sarah, to the extent that we're all swimming in American water, and we have seen the limits of American power. One of the things that we've seen with Afghanistan, Iraq, is that the sheer force that America can bring is not enough. And there are counterbalancing powers. Fareed Zakaria some years ago wrote about a post-American world. We're not in a post-American world, but we are in an American world where America has to contend with other interests. What does this election then say about what America may look like? Will we see a retreat perhaps into a Trumpian isolationism and a survival of the fittest? Are there limits to democratic interventionism, to policing the world? And to add another layer to that, is there not an hypocrisy at the heart of the American project that other countries now see through?
Absolutely, and I would flip that a little to carry on with what David was saying about these lines of continuity and points of rupture and how American power is seen throughout the world. And I often think about a comment a sort of a flippant comment that a friend of mine in Yemen made to me when Trump won the election back in 2016, and he said something along the lines of, finally the rest of the world, finally Americans, finally liberal Americans are seeing the American president in the way that we've always seen the American president. Like, this is how American power looks to the rest of the world. And so I would say that, to many places in the global south, and particularly the places that you've mentioned, Afghanistan, Iraq, all the ones that have experienced the full force of American intervention are probably looking at this and saying, Harris, Trump, same, a little bit different, but as a matter of degree. The idea that I think that the palpable sense is, particularly from within the Middle East, that whoever comes to power next, Israel is going to be enabled. And authoritarian power across the Middle East is going to be enabled to an increasing degree. And I think that,
Iran as well? Would Iran also be enabled
so
by that?
Iran's different, obviously. Iran is obviously in a very difficult position because they like this game where you ratchet up a little bit and then you pull back. You ratchet up a little bit more and you pull back. That's not working at the moment because for a number of reasons, but Israel has seen an opportunity to really push. But where the Iranian factor really comes in is in what they call their policy of forward defense. So in empowering, enabling, supporting these forces, whether in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Palestine, and in Yemen. And so the real question there, in terms of how that's going to enable authoritarianism, is just the degree to which these movements, and I'm thinking particularly here of the Houthis in Yemen, they are off the leash. They are now able to put into play a level of brutal control on the population that never would have been, that wasn't conceivable until the attacks, Hamas attacks on Israel.
One of the interesting things about your work is the way that you are able to bring local factors to play for geopolitical situations. And one of the really interesting things I found was, and having been a correspondent in the Middle East and being up very close to this, and you were right about this, is that we imagine that that there is a disconnect between the non-state terrorist actors and states themselves, and by empowering so-called legitimate actors, you will somehow negate the power of the terrorist groups, who are actually, there is a much more symbiotic relationship there. But how people on the ground see that, and then they look at America and say, you are adding to the problem because you don't see the reality of what we're seeing. Is there anything in this election that would suggest that either of these candidates would in any way be able to respond more to the intricacies of the reality on the ground and come up with something that is coherent to deal with the mega issues that we see played out every now and then in the news?
I mean, if you're going to talk about intricacies, I mean, you've got to go for Harris. Of course, she's going to have a more nuanced perspective than Trump is, for reasons that have already been broached here. But big picture, I mean, you go through and you just see the continuities of US foreign policy. I think one of the huge turning points, at least from a Middle Eastern perspective, was during Obama's presidency, and there was all the optimism, including across the Middle East, when he gave his speech at the university in Cairo.
A rapprochement with
Yeah.
the Muslim world.
That's right, and this was in 2009, and I think there was a genuine optimism across the region of, okay, Bush is out, maybe Iraq will wind down, maybe this time will be different. And then, of course, you had the uprisings across the region in 2011, where people came out and they demonstrated for all of the things
And
they
he
were told.
abandoned them.
And he did worse than abandon them.
Yeah.
He armed the counter-revolution. He supported all of the regimes in their attempts to quash people. And that is remembered.
He also underestimated Islamic State, who we stupidly referred to as a what do you call them? A
JV team.
JV team, a junior varsity team.
Yep.
And he also had no relationship with Israel in the end, an inability to speak with Netanyahu. We might come back to speak about that. But James, you have a very big picture look at the world. Philosophically, you bring quantum theory into play and the conversations that we have around this. Are we talking about something? We keep imagining that this can be rehabilitated, that there is a resuscitative process of being able to rescue liberal democracy. We hear political leaders constantly talking about the need to uphold a rules-based order. Well, I've been around the world and I can't find it written anywhere. And to the extent that it exists, it is entirely voluntary. But are we talking about something? To take the American project seriously, the first of the Enlightenment nations, the American Revolution sets fire to the world, imagining a world where we reimagine the possibilities of the human and human will. Has this project become so diffuse, so horizontal, that it no longer takes root? There is no vertical relationship to the horizontal nature of liberalism, and it ends up becoming worse than just a veil of ignorance. It becomes something that nobody can agree upon, let alone believe in.
It's become increasingly more difficult to project the Enlightenment view or the Greek view in the back there, or Alexander Lefebvre's view of liberalism as universal. I mean, I'm setting you up here, I'm teeing you up for a question later on. For a very long time, the projection of a particular interest through a universal ideology has created conflict. The gap opens up more widely now because it's harder and harder to build a consensus around that rule-based order. It's very difficult. My mentor, Hedley Bull, started off thinking that, yeah, the Western model was expanded, sometimes at the point of a bayonet, and sometimes bloody, sometimes it was reciprocal. But in the end, with the Global South, decolonization, new sources of power other than simply the power that explains the rise of the West, then you start to see the fractures. And I think we're at a cusp point right now where all of that old model that you were talking about, the Newtonian one, fixed borders, certainty, we know there's going to be a cause and effect with an arrow in between it. That's breaking down. And
But our politics doesn't reflect this. I see, constantly the reference to nations, national sovereignty, rules-based orders. No 13-year-old child in Australia lives in a fixed place and time. Their lives are beyond borders, and the idea of sovereignty inhabited in exceptionalism or state-based borders is going to be absurd to the reality of their lives. So we keep talking about who's going to be best for America, who will actually rescue the American project, how do we uphold this rules-based order, how do we improve our democracy and our liberalism, that horrible old quote from Churchill, it's the worst of all political systems apart from all the others. He would say that. But should we be looking beyond this?
yeah. Well, to the extent this election matters for geopolitics and global security, the topic, we're at a cusp between these two trends. One is, to be sure, globalization, which is about open borders, but it also created the very resentments and the disparities of wealth that you were talking about that led to the Trump, support in the Rust Belt of America and elsewhere, and in parts of Europe, of course. But simultaneously, there is this sort of the idea that identity now is more fluid, the idea of a nomadic existence, not fixed within a state. Right now, that's a luxury for the wealthiest people. So when you project that as an ideology or as a cosmology, you understandably are going to have a backlash. People say, we're not benefiting from this.
But the backlash takes many different forms. In the Middle East, it takes a fundamentalist form that
yeah.
may be around religion. In Russia, again, it takes a very deep traditional and a religious form
Yeah.
with Putin, with orthodoxy. And in America, it takes the form of a resentment at elites to the point where people will even vote against their interests just to have someone like Trump represent.
Like tariffs.
Like
tariffs are going to...
Tariffs will hurt poor people.
Yeah.
David,
Yeah.
you've quoted this idea of a slow violence, and particularly in reference to the environment, but I think it has broader application. When you look at it, and slow violence is, on the one hand, we take the environment, for instance, we have catastrophic events, big fires, big floods, natural disasters that capture our attention and focus on the impact of climate. And then there is the slow burn, the rising waters, the impoverishment of people, the movement of people that drives a reactionary politics against that. We don't often see the positives either, because we are clouded by the catastrophe, the doom that's constantly being represented by the catastrophic events. Can you take that idea of slow violence and lay that over the American election, and what that may mean for the environment, but also what it might mean more broadly?
Yeah, so this is a Rob Nixon term, right? This idea of slow violence, and yeah, the idea there is there's so much focus on the spectacular. So there's so much focus on these major events, the hurricanes, and and wars, and just the sort of everything the media focuses on. And in the meantime, people are dying because they're being polluted, from factories next door. They've got lead in their pipes, or you're inhaling, fumes from gas stoves. In your own home, which is just a whole European study on that and how many deaths it's causing. So there's plenty of that, and this is what the environmental justice movement and more generally the climate justice movement has been talking about. So slow violence in the Pacific, for example, during climate change is the slow nature of the desecration and the demolition, really, of indigenous cultures across the Pacific as waters come up. Something that for some reason the Australian government still can't get its head around. Because it's not a storm, right? It's not a cyclone. It is this gradual decimation of place. I guess two responses to the question, though. I mean, on the one hand, I think climate change is sort of undermining Nixon's thesis, because what we're getting is just sort of one spectacular event after another. So I've started to call this turbulence, climate turbulence. It's just this constant hit. And we're getting it, the US is getting it. It's, I mean, you turn on the news every day. So what, Spain just a couple of days ago, and major flooding and hundreds of people dead. So I think the slow is becoming much more spectacular now, and we're living in this age of just constant turbulence.
The slow violence may in fact now be political.
It's speeding up.
But the response to that is the slow violence of politics. It doesn't necessarily
the
respond.
response, and this is something I wanted to get out earlier. I mean, I've been in Australia 14 years, and one of the reasons I left is the polluted water, in a sense, the hatred in Arizona, where I lived, right? This is not a new thing, right? The politics of hatred and denigration and vengeance and racism I mean, that's not new, and it was thoroughly alienating. And I told people when I first got here, I mean, one of the reasons I left Arizona is the only other place I'd ever seen and felt this water of hatred was Northern Ireland during marching season, right? I mean, that's what it felt
Catholic,
like.
Protestant.
That's what the U.S. as a whole feels like. Anytime I go back now, there is this really hatred-filled, polluted water, and I think that, getting back to the environment question, that's going to be exported, right? So, and not necessarily foreign, but even just calling Puerto Rico a garbage patch and denigrating anyone who has experienced.
Or as Joe Biden did the other day, calling voters for Trump garbage.
I think he was referring to one person, but anyway.
But you see how these things are heard.
Yeah, but the breadth of the hatred at a time when we need maybe not a rules-based order, but at least some level of collaboration and cooperation globally, right? So, I mean, one of the big differences for me is going to be what the US's position is on a loss and damage fund or on an adaptation fund. Thinking about the position in the COP, the biodiversity COP, which is finishing up, the climate COP, which is starting. I mean, the US at least has some sort of presence there. And I think given what has happened domestically with the IRA, I think there is more of a focus on justice in adaptation, justice in loss and damage. So I think there's a potential there with a Harris administration, but with a Trump administration, that hate just gets exported, that ocean of hate and that sense of vengeance.
There's no moral ballast to the questions that we have to ponder when it comes.
No moral anything.
But if you're seeking to provide leadership that can build consensus for the global response to climate that's required, somebody has to be able to do that. And if you're talking about hypocrisy that we've discussed today, how do you do that? The other thing I'm mindful of course, David, is that while on the one hand, a Harris regime may be able to bring more leadership, morality and innovation to the response to climate, we still have the reality that America today still exports weapons to 57% of all autocratic regimes in the world to destroy the environment and kill each other. That's not going to change regardless of who gets elected, is it?
No. I mean, there's plenty that won't change, and I'm not going to make an argument that Harris is going to be, good for the world in any stretch of the imagination. But I'm really curious about why they dropped this notion of the politics of joy so quickly, right? I think
it wasn't working.
No, I think it was. I mean, I think they got a lot of attention and there was a lot of emotion. The same thing is happening in the climate space where there's this doomist mentality and then there's this idea of hope that's backed by action, this idea of hope with teeth. I mean, it's a really interesting switch that work needs to be done and can be applied, but I mean, they've just focused on the incompetence of Trump, which is a great line, but the joy stuff, I think.
I've got a theory about the way that this has developed. And this was when Harris came in, Democrats were so scared and so demobilised that they needed something completely different. A few years ago, a couple of political scientists, friends of mine, Antoine Banks and Eric Grunendijk, wrote a really good article in the Journal of Political Psychology based on experimental research. They said basically fear is a demobilising emotion. Anger is a mobilising emotion. Hope is a mobilising emotion. Fear is a demobilising emotion. When Harris came in, she needed the opposite of fear.
She couldn't go anger, so she had...
So she went joy. So she went hope. And that was, for a couple of months, it was all about getting Democrats back on board. And this is what she did very effectively, partly by essentially running as a generic Democrat that anyone could project anything they wanted onto her. However, she reached this point of, I think it's been very clear from about the debate between Trump and Harris onwards, that, okay, so she reassembled the Democratic coalition, she's going to do a lot better than Biden would have done. But the theory is that to win, they need Republicans who might be sick of Donald Trump just not to vote. Maybe to vote for her, maybe just not to vote. And this is why during that debate with Trump, during recent speeches, it sounds like she's talking very specifically to Nikki Haley voters. She's not even talking to Democrats anymore. She's talking to Nikki Haley voters. Like, look at my endorsement from Dick Cheney. Yeah, I've got George W. Bush's daughter campaigning for me. The switch back to fear, the switch back to these
Did the assassination attempt play a role in this? You know, if someone's come within a hair's breadth of having their brains blown out, did that change the optics and the atmosphere of that, where the joy message was no longer going to?
Well, she came in after the assassination attempt. I think what that did, that convinced Democrats that Trump was going to win. Democrats were as influenced by everybody else of the images of Trump popping back up and raising his fist. It created this image of invincibility. This is what she needed to overcome. What I find remarkable is how quickly Americans forgot about the assassination attempt. Now, maybe it's because there were 4 people shot at that rally. That qualifies under the FBI definition of a mass shooting. It was the 300th mass shooting in the United States that year. This is a country where acts of violence are quickly forgotten because they're so common. But I think that, to go back to it, I think the going back to fear now, she's actually trying to inspire fear in Republicans. She's trying to persuade a certain number of Republicans to stay home. I think that this is why we're seeing, maybe I'm assuming too much that her campaign operatives have been reading the Journal of Political Psychology, but this is how I might have planned out the campaign.
I want to come to your questions in a minute, so I hope you've got some questions to come, but I want to come back to Xian, particularly to look at the role of gender. There is a possibility of having a woman and a woman of colour as president, and yet a lot of women are voting for Trump. Clearly, a lot of, I suppose that may split along racial lines or demographic lines as well. Is that cutting through? Is the fact that this is a possibility of an historical moment of a woman becoming president, is that playing any role here, any role of any significance in the campaign?
I would say almost minor significance. There are major gendered aspects. However, the Democrats know that because of how, these tensions and these culture wars within US society at the moment, they know that they're not going to win if they say you should vote for the first female black president. That's not going to win them the vote, right? There are a few major gender issues here. So one is abortion. So it's been really interesting in the last few days. Tim Walz has been out a lot, talking about the fear that women should have if Trump were to be re-elected, and playing this very different kind of masculine role. I've wrote it down, the direct quote that Trump said yesterday, "I will be the protector of women whether they like it or not." Yes, we should all, laugh and then be very worried about that. And I wanted to point out as well the issue of abortion and how much that's played into as this big domestic concern. It also has real international consequences as well, with the Mexican policy, otherwise known as the Global Gag Rule, which is the policy that was implemented from Reagan onwards, implemented by every Republican president and then taken back with every Democratic president, which means that the US limits money to go to international NGOs or organizations if they have anything to do with abortion. Not just helping people with reproductive health, but also advising them on reproductive health. Trump reinstated that global gag rule when he took over from Obama, and also widened it to make it have much more severe consequences. And there's been really interesting coverage this week in how countries like Nepal, they're still feeling the real effects of the global gag rule, their reproductive health. So I think two things. I think obviously for Kamala Harris to be elected, it will be monumental for American society. I think the blatant misogyny and how that has interacted with racism, and I really don't believe in the States you can talk about gender without talking about race, is incredibly interesting and alarming to watch. And I think that is a real distinct difference regarding their governing styles, regarding if Trump were to be re-elected or Kamala to be elected.
I might pick up on something in your essay you wrote. Stan wrote a great essay in the monthly magazine on America, and one of the themes of it is how tough American life is. I mean, for anyone who's lived there, spent a decent amount of time there, a lot of people are on the minimum wage, as you talked about, and not able to pay their rent, not able to be above the poverty line, although they're working full time. So the sense of, as David picked up on the point first up, that there's these obvious problems. There's the obvious problem of addressing climate change with really serious sort of policy, but the political system doesn't allow, and it doesn't really allow for candidates who come forward to break the kind of mold of winning a landslide or bringing the Congress with them with 60 senators plus. That is incredibly hard. So you have this pantomime every 3-4 years of people getting up and having the sort of old Paul Keating line, you change the leader, you change the country. We over-project through each leader, and some leaders like Obama enjoy that America will change when Obama is elected. But the problems remain the same, and many of particularly the inequality, the sort of difficulty of life in America for so many people, those problems are pretty baked in, and you're going to have one set of false promises after another, as you were pointing to.
There was a wonderful book written some years ago now, it came out, I think, the tail end of the Obama, or just before Trump came in, called Deaths of Despair, and I would encourage everybody to read it, by Anne Case and Angus Deaton, two economists. And without making a political claim or argument, they just went through line by line of the reality of life for most Americans, not just poor, because most Americans now are poor, and the loss of faith in democracy that they believed was a sham. And there was this devastating sentence, talking about American politics, in hoc to big, to big power, in hoc to elites, bought and paid for by lobbyists, passing laws to put more money into rich people's hands. Healthcare is a scandal. Machines making people redundant, big pharma having people hooked on drugs. And this was the sentence. The Sheriff of Nottingham has taken up residence in Washington, DC, and the good cops have left town. Robin Hood is nowhere to be seen. And for a lot of Americans, that's what they see. Before we come to questions, Brendan, something you wrote that I really want to get a comment on, and I might just get a quick response, Sarah, about this as well. You said, if Trump is elected, Australia may have to look at red lines, lines that recast that relationship. We're already in deep with AUKUS. We know that the drums of war have been beating about China now for years, and the preparation for potential conflict. But what do you mean by those red lines? What would trigger them? What should they be? What should Australia be concerned? What does it mean for the American-Australian alliance?
Yeah, I mean, the first person I'd be worried about is Jack Smith. I mean, this attorney who's, got good evidence on Trump inciting the January 6 riots, building evidence that Trump claimed that there was a stolen election in 2020 when there obviously wasn't. So Trump has said he'd deport Jack Smith. I don't know where to. Maybe Australia is an option. New Zealand's gone in a different direction recently, so that's not as available. Similarly, the Georgia prosecutor, and then from there onwards, the kind of independent judiciary. Is this something Australia cares about its closest ally having? The claims Stephen Miller will be back in the White House, the claims that illegal immigrants are going to be rounded up and then turned into kind of camps. What will Australia's view be on that? Will Australia sort of have a position? And series of kind of, to think that there could be more of a kind of open American position on Israel, for some of us it's maybe hard to imagine, but it would be more open in terms of Trump making this ridiculous statement that Netanyahu should finish the job in Gaza. So all of those things, there could be many more uncomfortable questions for a Prime Minister, for a Labor Prime Minister to say, well, what are your values? And what are the values of your closest ally? And are those misaligned? And is that a problem to you? Or is this a world of naked power?
Sarah, do you have a thought on that?
Look, not so much on how the Australians would respond. We got a pretty good insight into that the last time around. We might say some things
We
that we don't really love this, but yes, accommodate. And now that we're all in with AUKUS, there's not a lot of wiggle room that we've left ourselves. So I think there'll be some discomfort, but probably.
What about countries like France, for instance? What about other countries in Europe? What does it mean for NATO? Because we saw before there were prospect of changing the relationship with NATO. How would they feel?
Look, I think I'm gonna go broader again, because I think what we're seeing is the ways in which the global order or the rules-based order, it's becoming very, very clear the degree to which this is based on norms, not anything else that we can put on paper. And I think that is what what is going to guide the way that the rest of the world is seeing Trump. How do we navigate through the white spaces between the black lines? These black lines that we thought were what was guiding behavior and holding it all together, that's not doing it. So I think we're going to see, a real recalibration on just how do we move in the spaces between.
Any questions? Oh, yeah, the hands are going up very quickly, straight away. Yes, thank you.
I was just interested what the panel thinks the role of non-compulsory, compulsory voting is great, but that need to get people out, how much that feeds into extremism, because you have to motivate people to come out and vote. What role do you think that plays?
I might go to David. You're American, and James might want to weigh in on this as well. But here we have compulsory voting, and it's often said to mitigate the potential of extremes that we see in the US. But in the US, getting out the vote, the fact that it's not compulsory, how does that play out?
I think this is going to be an issue this time, especially among youth, and youth disillusioned by the support for Israel. Right? And I've got two kids in late 20s who are just so appalled.
You're like me. I still call my kids
kids,
but then
they're citizens. We're all dual citizens, but we can vote. I doubt either one of them will, because of this sense of it will make no difference to some of the issues that are so important to me, around gender, for example, and around certainly around Israel. Anti-Zionist Jews are not getting much of a say in things these days. So I think there's just going to be quite a low turnout there, and I think this idea that they're pushing for more Republicans to vote or refrain from voting, and really giving up on a lot of youth, even the climate youth, who you think because of the IRA, because the Biden administration had done so much more than any other administration on climate, they're not going to vote for it. They'll just stay home because they can't abide by this contradiction in Harris' campaign of being supportive of climate but not doing anything around it.
James?
I would just echo that. I think that what we haven't really gotten into is, we're talking about the dysfunctionalism of democracy, but in particular, American-style democracy, the Electoral College, where the last few elections you can win the popular vote with people voting, and then you have the system, but originally designed to make sure the southern states join the federation because of slavery. The Electoral College is broken, basically, the system right now. So it requires, an amendment process, which is very difficult in America, and it has happened before, women voting. But that would probably, maybe, if Harris is bold enough, could be a step forward. But of course, they'd have to have the Senate, wouldn't they, David, to put something like that through? Yeah.
If there's low turnout, who does it favour? Who's penalised more?
Oh, that is a very good question. And that varies significantly from election to election. There's a kind of mythology that if you had universal voting, that the Democrats would always win. I don't think that's actually true, but it's one of the reasons why Republicans are so opposed to any kind of changes that might make it easier for people to vote. There's this deep sense on both sides, which I don't think has any empirical basis, that if more people voted, Democrats would win. Earlier this year, it looked like it was going to be a much lower turnout election than either of the previous two, bearing in mind that the previous two were the highest turnout elections for 100 years, 66% of people voting at the last one. Given the
registered people.
Yes, yeah. Registered, yes. Given the total lack of enthusiasm for a Biden-Trump contest earlier this year, it looked like it was going to be a much lower turnout contest, and it also looked like that if Biden was going to have any chance, if turnout was just going to be as low as possible. That was the general sense, because Democrats have more high propensity voters. You see this in midterm elections. In 2022, one of the reasons Democrats outperformed expectations was that so many more of them came out. So the thinking earlier in the year was, if turnout is low enough, Democrats could still scrape over the line because they've got the high propensity voters who vote no matter what. But Trump does seem to get Republicans out who just don't vote under any other circumstances. And so I think I don't want to make any predictions. I wouldn't be surprised if this is lower turnout than maybe the previous election. I think it's still going to be relatively high by the standards of the US, but all the polling data I see suggests people are still not very enthusiastic about this contest.
Yeah, but there's more than the contest on the ballot.
Yes, that's true.
And so
yes.
where there are abortion amendments
Yes.
on the ballot, that's going to motivate people.
Yes, yeah.
So another question? One here and one there.
Do you think after the election and after 2 years, there's possibility of other superpowers to kind of rise, especially in Asia Pacific, and smaller nations kind of leaning away from US?
I guess, like I said before, I think the US, America's political capital and even its soft power, it's got tremendous soft power across the world, but that is falling away. They've still, people still watch their movies and their television, and they've got, a real repertoire on how, on American culture. But as the politics becomes more abhorrent to people across the world, not to put too fine on it, then that you do see that soft power going. So, and how that relates then to the rise of other powers. China, you see the way that it's posturing all across Africa and in the Middle East. They don't have that soft power buy-in in the way that the US does. They're so far away from that.
Money.
They've got money, and they don't have political expectations on. Well, they do have political expectations on how the money is spent.
As long as they allow China to do it, but they
It's-
don't have it doesn't come with
It's not
with a
normative.
moral.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, which is a big difference.
And that has implications for the environment as well, of course. You want to Brendan, how do you see this? How would, if you were, I hate to do this to you, but if you were Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping and you were looking at this election, what outcome would you be looking for to further your interests?
I think generally the needle has been promoting Trump. I mean, particularly for the Russians. I mean, there's a lot in it with the Ukrainian situation. There'll be another dilemma for Australia. Trump making this, usual kind of claim that the war will be over within a few days might just mean that the supplying of arms to the Ukraine might stop. Elon Musk has been making a lot of money off the US government by charging them for the satellite technology that's being used by the Ukrainian forces. So I think, the Russians, it's much clearer. If American democracy is seen to be failing, that gives to their kind of view of the world that democracies don't really work. So the disinformation campaign from the Russians, I think, is very much been pro-Trump, whether it's made a huge difference or not. Lots of people will argue that for a long time. The Chinese, I think it's much more complicated. I mean, they see
trade war last time.
They see the signs on climate change. There's still obviously being cooperation between the two major powers on this. On trade, they have a lot to lose. If a massive trade tariff comes in, whether it'll be 60%, that might be sort of World Wrestling Federation talk from Trump, but there will be a tariff. And that, I think, for a Chinese economy could be very troublesome. So, I think they would probably, they know the playbook of what Harris will do. I don't think Harris will be profoundly different from Biden in this regard. So I wouldn't have thought they were all of the people who write Xi Jinping speeches that Kevin Rudd relied upon to write a book of Xi's thought, all hoping, for a Trump victory by any means.
Can I just go back to you when you ask questions, you said a lot of smaller countries as well. What do you think smaller countries, when you ask the question, what do you think their calculation might be?
I think there's a possibility of the shift towards the Chinese government, especially if Trump does win, and it kind of becomes that rhetoric that you all spoke about, the hatred and this and that, and the unpredictability of US kind of makes smaller nations not really trust.
And that has implications for the Pacific, of course,
Yes.
and for Australia, and we know China's, and some countries in the Pacific have already switched allegiances.
I think there's another possibility as well, which is the non-aligned world is becoming more non-aligned than ever.
Yeah.
There was an article I really liked by Matthias Spector, who's a Brazilian political scientist in foreign affairs, last year, called In Defense of the Fence Sitters. Countries that just do not involve themselves in conflicts where Russia, China, or the United States is involved. There was always a very principled stance behind the non-aligned movement about maintaining independence from these major powers. There's also a very logical and practical stance, which is when you have no idea which one of these major powers is ultimately going to prevail, why would you tie yourself to any one of them? And I think that we'll see smaller countries at the margins. They will strategically use larger countries where it supports them. We see this in the Pacific. We see some countries being very instrumental about the way that they switch allegiances. These countries are not just puppets of the US and China. These are countries who can see what they can actually get out of the conflict. But I think that the overall stance that increasing numbers of countries are going to take is a basically fence-sitting one, because the major powers are always going to need these countries.
Yeah.
I was just
Thanks for your patience.
building on a number of the comments from the panel, looking at this election through the prism of feelings. So, for example, The Economist last week branded the American economy the envy of the world. But, the economy is not something that Kamala Harris is able to really run on because many Americans feel disillusioned. What you were saying about, the climate bill, a record investment in climate action, many young progressives are not feeling like that's getting them to motivate. And even with Stan about the economic disparity and stuff, I mean, The Apprentice, which built Trump into, you know, the embodiment of that 1%, somehow, you know, a lot of these working class people that you talked about, the backbreaking, you know, individuals, you know, rush to support him. So, you know, obviously human emotions and human feelings will always have been a source of politics. Just that as well, the way that Democrats even are trying to deal differently. In 2016 in the debates, Hillary would constantly say when he said something outrageous, go fact check that online. But the Democrats aren't really doing that anymore because they know that that's kind of not really the point. So, I just, you know...
No, it's a really good question, and we know that there is an emotional response, and you know that's what politics seeks to evoke, is an emotional response. David and James, how do you see that? David, how do you explain that in America? Someone votes against their interests because there is an emotional response to something, a la Trump. That programs like The Apprentice are so watched, and he has to have that heroic status.
Yeah.
But people watch car crashes, and people love circus acts. But how do you explain that? What both of you, James, how do you explain the
As
feelings?
an American, explain yourselves as an American. Look, I mean, you know, we grew up with that, and it's always that sort of play on emotions. But I wanted to expand that a little bit because we're talking about emotion, and we're talking about countries and Trump, but there's this whole other realm we haven't touched on, which is the billionaire class and the Musks and the Teals and that kind of emotion. I mean, the attachment to Musk scares the shit out of me as much as the rest, you know, as the rest of the political situation. And I think there's a sense of worship and trust in some of these, you know, the Silicon billionaires and that whole class that really worries me in the climate space as well, right? Because as there's this sort of continued breakdown of Trumpism, there's a breakdown of collaboration around climate, and there's more impact and more turbulence that I talked about. This whole, you know, tech bro class has a series of instruments and geoengineering and the permissibility and the support for that, right? These are the techno saviors, right?
So it says we don't need to think about the environment because the tech bros will fix it.
Exactly, and there is that attachment to that imaginary, right? That technology will fix the problem, and these guys know what they're doing, and that worries me as much as that sort of attachment, the emotional attachment to Trump and others.
James.
Yeah, two things. One is...
Are you an emotional American? Or,
I don't wear it on my sleeve, but yeah, I get emotional. I think that the difference is we all get emotional. We want to know what's going to make us safe. Okay, that's the theme of security. And it's going to vary according to your demographic, your gender, your race. It's going to be very different. But one thing we all have in common is, you know, our brains are geared for fight or flight. Okay, so emotion trumps reason often, quite frequently, when the world is considered to be a dangerous place. And people play on that. Trump plays on the fear of the other, fear of, you know, coming over the walls, the fear of the pathogen. And you know, the difference is that fear has been there, but now it can be force multiplied instantaneously through social media. We are all networked on an affect network, not effect, but affect. And that's the big difference now. How do you put firewalls up against that? Well, it's difficult. It's very difficult, and we're seeing social media failing repeatedly on that.
Well, the Russians are taking advantage of that.
That bots and everybody else are taking advantage of that, yes.
I was just going to quickly say, it's just, it's so simplistic to point it out again and again, but we really do have to look at social media and how it's feeding into this culture war. I saw Kamala Harris's recent comments on the environment, being very proud about the amount of oil that's getting drilled under the Biden administration, and her restating that she won't ban fracking. Obviously, we know that, as David pointed out, the Biden administration has done so much for climate change. Why does she feel the need to say these things? Because of that way in which fracking oil has been strategically was taken by Trump, right? Let's go back to drilling in the 2016 election. we're going to stop the war on American gas and oil. This culture war issues, which Elon Musk just loves now he has X/Twitter to kind of exacerbate, so kind of have become so intrinsic, I think, to American culture particularly. Yes.
That's good. Another question? Yeah.
It seems to me with Tulsi Gabbard, for example, she was a Democrat until 2022, now she's a Republican. She seems to have a strong following, especially with men, maybe 20 to 49. Do you think that would make sense to the voters who may have voted previously Democrat and go towards the Republican Party?
Who was that, sorry?
Tulsi Gabbard.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I find half the time thinking about the gender gap in voting patterns. I was reading a lot of analysis this week on, do we over-exaggerate it too much? How much of this gap is there really? We do know at the moment that, women are definitely seeming to be supporting Harris at much larger intervals. I think regarding the way in which particular kind of expressions of femininity have been tied to republicanism under Trump has been really interesting to watch. And I think that, gender is continuing to play such a huge role. And there's so many white female Trump supporters still that are very kind of openly campaigning for him. And again, I think it comes back to the fact that we can't untie race from gender in the States.
I think, David, part of what factors into this too is Trump's played to this, others have played to this, it's very strong on social media, but the idea that men are losing their place, men are being displaced, that what does it mean to be a man in the society? Jordan Peterson references this a lot. To what is this? It's all part of the mix, but how much of this is part of the ability for Trump to? I mean, Trump's votes held up, his support is held up. 4 years out of power, it's held up.
Yeah.
How much of a factor is that?
I think that it's a very important factor, and it's not, well, it's the way that the cultural element interacts with the economic element. When Trump talks about jobs, he's talking specifically about manufacturing, mining and construction. Jobs which are traditionally coded as male in the United States. One of the fascinating things I've noticed over the last few years is the way that Republicans talk about union workers. Right? They don't really talk about unions themselves. They don't, Trump in particular has quite a personal dislike of unions, but they love talking about union workers. Part of it is cultural nostalgia. It summons up the conservative, patriotic, hard-hatted workers who were beating the hippies up in the streets of New York in the 1970s over the Vietnam War. But there is also, when they say union worker, even though now your median member of a union in the United States is going to be a female teacher rather than a male factory worker, when they say union worker, they're talking about a particular category of work which they say this is important and this has to be protected. When you look at the breakdown of employment in the United States, these kinds of sectors, manufacturing, mining, construction, forestry, together they make up about 12.5% of the workforce. Something like 70% of the US workforce is the service industry, various service industries. The single biggest factor in that is health workers. People who go mainly to people's homes, older people's homes, to look after them. That's low status, badly paid work. And it's not what Americans like to think of when they think about work. Or another huge category is the number of people who work for state and local government. These are perfectly noble, honourable jobs that do a lot of good. That's not what Americans like to think about when they think of work. They like to think about this traditional understanding of production, this traditional understanding of the United States making things and dominating the world through the things that it makes. So the economic pitch to men is very much tied up to a cultural pitch, and the idea that the disappearance of those kinds of jobs is something that the United States allowed to happen.
This is why it's weird that he's cosplaying as a McDonald's worker.
That is very weird, yes.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
the hive is,
I mean, that makes it understandable where we've got the kind of stereotype of sort of MAGA voter. But, I mean, Hillary Clinton lost the white female vote in America. Biden lost it by a larger margin. A lot of old people, a lot of white old people are going to vote for Trump. They would vote for any Republican, basically. I mean, one of the things about this election is, you know, we overdetermine a lot of things on the candidates. Probably a more moderate or maybe just a generic Republican would have won probably quite easily. I mean, the mood for change, the amount of blame that the Harris and Biden have received for inflation in the United States, housing prices, interest rates, things will be difficult here for a government. They're things which, in a generic race against a Republican, would have been hard. Trump brings people out against him. In some ways, he makes us closer because there's a lot of people who just do not want him to be president.
I was just going to say to your point as well, the choice of J.D. Vance, I found, that sounded a bit posh, the choice of J.D. Vance,
I didn't know you were from Adelaide.
Was so interesting because I'm not sure if you watched the Tim Walz J.D. Vance debate, but it was so impressive to watch Vance speak. He's so good at going back into, you know, obviously he wrote Hillbilly Elegy, but that mythos, I found that he was so great at communicating, being able to communicate to voters. I recognise economic hardship. And whether or not you, again, just point out it's cosplay, it's hypocrisy, I think it's very effective with voters.
One quick one left. Does anyone have a final question? Yeah, thank
I was just wondering, in terms of those red lines we discussed before, and the potential Trump presidency for Australia, do you think that would encourage Australians to look at new security partnerships, potentially something like CAMS that will bring it closer to more some historical or traditional allies?
Yeah, I suppose I'm one of those people who's very disillusioned with Australian foreign policy and has the view that Trump has been normalised, as people said before. You know, there were all these statements from leading politicians in Australia when Trump emerged in 2015 saying this guy's beyond the pale. We can't deal with someone like this. The way he talks about Mexicans as rapists is just unconscionable. But often, like racism in general or sexism in general, people say, well, that's terrible, and then just get on with it and sort of accept it and kind of normalise it. So I think there's been a lot of normalising with Trump. As for Australia, thinking more independently, AUKUS I think makes that hard. I mean, putting the alliance on hold, that's hard when you've committed such an enormous amount of money. I mean, if it's up $380 billion promised, the federal budget on defence, about $60 billion a year, gives you some sense of how big that is. So, yeah, I don't hold a lot of hope. I mean, Trump would, I think, have to do something dramatic early on. And I think the Albanese government will be focusing on a lot of domestic issues. So
they're also coming into an election. Just to finish up on, I'll just finish with three to my left. I'm a Liberal, I've got to think left and right to make that assessment. It's a weird Liberal thing. What are the priorities for America of the next 4 years, regardless of who gets in, but right now from each of your own particular areas, what are the priorities?
The priorities for
the US, for whoever will be the president.
Okay, I'm going to again look from the Middle East because to me everything about the world now and many times turns on what happens there. And I think we're going to see an effort to sort of just clamp down and solidify what they can hold, which is going to be very challenging for them. But I think they want to they always follow this path of stability, stabilization. We're just going to keep the status quo going for as long as we possibly can. And that means entrenching in place some really, really brutal regimes. And I think that's going to be what their attempt will be.
I think the top priority, and something we haven't really talked about, is we're about 45 seconds, no, a minute and a half away from high noon, or midnight rather, on the nuclear clock. We haven't talked about nuclear proliferation, nuclear accidents. We have Koreans about to go into the battlefield, North Koreans in Ukraine, and the possible use of nuclear weapons in your lifetime has gone up. So I put that pretty high on the agenda. Also, potentially catastrophic is what's going to happen with generative AI. We haven't talked about that. And the final thing I would say is the very strength of what's produced wealth is also our greatest vulnerability, the supply chain. You know, we're very vulnerable.
As we saw in COVID.
COVID, no toilet paper in the stores. What happens when there's no food? This is going to be something that the next leader is going to have to deal with.
And environment plays into that vulnerability.
Exactly. I mean, my response is going to be obvious, and it's climate and biodiversity. But it's just sort of the ecological systems that support human behavior, right? I mean, if there's no American leadership in this space, if there's no American collaboration, if the U.S., even if they just don't, they just need to step aside and let others get on with it instead of blocking. That to me is the major thing over the next 4 years, because it's just, the climate impacts are just going to get worse and worse.
Isn't it wonderful the world that we've laid bare for you today as you sit here about to inherit the mess that our generation has created? I know you're going to have better answers to the future than my generation did. Please thank the panel. And thank you for coming, for being so attentive, listening, and your wonderful questions. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.